because it was 50 years ago last year that Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan issued his famous report. And I probably don't need to remind you about this. So Moynihan, back in 1964, writes his report, and he says, births to single mothers in the general American population are in the single digits. 5% of all Americans in the 60s were being born to single moms. And he says, but within the African American community, they're starting to approach 1/4. 25% of black kids are being born to single mothers. And Moynihan says this is going to be problematic. He's immediately criticized and attacked for being a racist. Even though he was a liberal senator from New York and he was a liberal Harvard professor, he's attacked for being racist. In his defense, he says, I'm not a racist. It's precisely because I care about the black family that I wrote this report, because something's going on to change this family structure. And we know that the family structure is the heart of social justice. Fast forward to today. Remember, the stats that I mentioned was that general population are in the single digits, and in the African American community, 25%. Today, it's 40% of all Americans are born to single moms. 50% of Hispanic children and over 70% of African Americans are born to single mothers. The first thing to say is that gays and lesbians aren't to blame for this. Straight people are. It's heterosexuals who bought into a lie about the family and human sexuality that came out of Hollywood. It came out of the sexual revolution. It doesn't come out of the church. It comes out of forces hostile to that vision. But as heterosexuals bought into this, that's what gave us the hookup culture. It's what gave us the rise of premarital sex, of non-marital childbearing, of absentee fathers, the increase in divorce, the introduction of no-fault divorce laws. It's only after 40 years of heterosexuals making a mess of marriage and a cultural redefinition of marriage that 5 unelected judges could legally redefine marriage. And so it's important to see kind of here, the interplay between law and culture. And what we have to be concerned about is marriage. Not just the same-sex part, but marriage as a whole. What's going on within the American family that so many children are growing up without their moms and dads. Here's the problem. Before his evolution, President Obama spoke repeatedly about the importance of fathers. He spoke about the importance of fathers because he had grown up without his father. And he says, the exact quote, I've tried to be for Michelle and my daughters what my dad wasn't for me and my mom. The question for the post-evolution Obama is, how do we insist that fathers are essential when the law has redefined marriage to make fathers optional? You can't simultaneously say a child deserves a mom and a dad when you said that 2 moms or 2 dads is the same thing. I mean, cognitive dissonance, you can't hold both of those things to be true simultaneously. And the law is now teaching that marriage is primarily about consenting adult romance and caregiving. So what took place 2 months ago with the Supreme Court ruling was that it took the vision of human sexuality that the 60s gave us, the sexual revolution gave us, and it simply inserted it into our Constitution. What did the 60s tell us? It says consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do, and the kids will be all right. It says that marriage should last as long as the love lasts. Love makes a family. Gays and lesbians didn't create those slogans. Heterosexuals who bought into a bad liberal ideology created those slogans. And the problem with this court ruling is that it doubles down on those slogans. It'll make it that much harder to reform the culture. Now, of course, if you think the past 40 or 50 years of American family life has been good for children, good for women, good for communities, then by all means cheer the Supreme Court's ruling. But if you think the rise of non-marital childbearing and of single-parent homes and of absentee dads have been a problem for the country, you certainly shouldn't cheer the legal redefinition of marriage. That'll make things worse. One of the best ways of illustrating this, especially, I don't know how long you've been in D.C. Are you visiting D.C. or are you all local?
No.
Visiting. So when I've traveled, most cities seem to have this sort of dynamic that D.C. has. Different neighborhoods with different outcomes. Georgetown and Anacostia will be my examples here in D.C. In Georgetown, you have a bunch of kids who graduate from high school and go on to college. They get good-paying jobs. They never go to jail. And they then pass on those blessings to their children because they get married and have kids inside of marriage. In Anacostia, you have lower graduation rates, higher incarceration rates, lower employment rates, and then higher subsequent family fragmentation. What's the difference between Georgetown and Anacostia? Is it that one has better government, that one has better curbside recycling, one has better tax rates? It's family structure. The kids in Georgetown are being born into and raised by their married mothers and fathers, and the kids in Anacostia aren't. These kids aren't to blame for this. Frequently, the mothers aren't to blame. The single moms are the heroes of these stories. They're the only ones who actually take responsibility and love and care for these kids. But there's a crisis of men. And that's what's going to be harder to address when we've redefined marriage to make these men optional. So let me go to what I said I would start with, the 3 lessons from the pro-life movement. Lesson 1, pro-lifers rejected Roe v. Wade. They've never said Roe v. Wade is good constitutional law. They said that Roe v. Wade was judicial activism. It was unelected judges making policy from the bench. The people had gone and made policies that protected unborn children. Judges didn't like those policies, so they simply struck them down. The same thing's taken place on this marriage issue. The people went to the ballot boxes. They voted to define marriage as the union of a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, a mom and a dad. Unelected judges didn't like that outcome, so they struck it down. But there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that tells us, is marriage a gendered institution, male-female, or is it a genderless institution, consenting adult romance? The U.S. Constitution is silent on that question. And where the Constitution is silent, we, the people, get to govern ourselves. We, the people, get to make law where there's not something in the Constitution that overrides us. And so the first thing we have to do is say that the Supreme Court got marriage wrong, and it got the Constitution wrong, and it's not the last word. In the same way pro-lifers have said that Roe v. Wade is not the last word. And year by year by year, we see they keep making more and more progress. And these Planned Parenthood videos right now are awakening these people's consciences, those who have seen them. The media refuses to cover these Planned Parenthood videos precisely because they know the potential to be so powerful. The second thing, so the second lesson from the pro-life movement, is they protected their freedom. And I think this is particularly important right now when you see what's going on for religious liberty for those schools, charities, businesses, all walks of life, people who believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman. How will the government treat them? Because what we've seen so far is that bakers and florists and photographers have been fined by the government thousands of dollars for not violating their beliefs about marriage. Catholic charity adoption agencies have been shut down in 3 different jurisdictions because they wanted to find orphans' homes with married moms and dads. And the government said that's discrimination against married gays and lesbians. You have to treat all married couples equally. That's the logic of marriage equality. And so sometimes we have these Catholic charity adoption agencies who are finding homes for the hardest to place children with a mother and a father, and they were shut down because they didn't share the government's vision of family. We've also seen the question of what's going to happen to Christian schools. Will they retain their accreditation? Will they retain their nonprofit tax status? Something similar happened to the pro-lifers. In the 70s and 80s, the activists argued every doctor should have to perform abortion, every nurse should have to assist at abortion, every healthcare plan and hospital should pay for abortion. Abortion is a constitutional right. Abortion is healthcare like any other healthcare. There should be no conscience rights, no religious liberty rights. The liberal extremists lost that debate and the pro-lifers won. Up until Obamacare, that is. It's only within the past couple of years that we had to re-argue this. And right now you have a group of nuns suing the Obama administration because of this. You have Wheaton College, you have Notre Dame, you have all sorts of Christian schools and universities suing the government because they're now trying to make them pay for abortion-causing drugs, when up until that point we had a consensus. Even if you're in favor of abortion, you don't make a pro-lifer pay for abortion or perform abortion. But there were extremists who tried to do that back then, and there are extremists today trying to do it now. On the marriage issue, we have to establish the principle that even if you're in favor of gay marriage, that doesn't give you a right to force someone else to bake you a same-sex wedding cake, or force someone else to be the wedding photographer at your same-sex wedding, or to force someone else to be the florist who does the floral arrangements for your same-sex wedding. If America stands for anything, it stands for freedom. And the freedom here is, say, If you're in favor of same-sex marriage, bake the wedding cake, do the flowers, take the pictures. But if you're not in favor, you should be free to not have to do so. The beauty of pluralism, of diversity, of tolerance, of peaceful coexistence is that the black church should be free to be the black church. Jews should be free to be Jews. Catholics should be free to be Catholics. Evangelicals free to be evangelicals. Muslims free to be Muslims. We should each be free to live in accordance with our beliefs, not forced by the government to accept someone else's beliefs. That's what's going to be at stake now. Will your institutions be free to serve the public in accordance with your beliefs? Or will you be forced the way that they're trying to force the Little Sisters of the Poor into accepting someone else's beliefs? And we're going to see a lot of this happening on these questions about marriage and the family and human sexuality. Because what's being challenged is the basic Genesis truth that we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other in marriage. And whether it's the transgender debates or the marriage debates, we're redefining humanity and anthropology and marriage and the family. And the principle here should be each and every one of you should be free to believe what your church teaches and then to live it out in your daily life. And we're going to have to work to protect that freedom. The third lesson from the pro-life movement was that it's no good saying the Supreme Court gets a case wrong and saying you have freedom to live in accordance with the truth if you don't actually live in accordance with the truth. So the third lesson is the most important lesson, which is that the pro-life movement has been bearing witness to the truth for 42 years now, and we have to do the same on the marriage issue. I started today by saying it's only after a cultural redefinition of marriage that a legal redefinition is possible. Anthony Kennedy and the 4 liberal judges wouldn't have been able to legally redefine marriage if every heterosexual was living a chaste, monogamous, permanent, exclusive marriage in their own life. It's only when you have the breakdown of the family, premarital sex, non-marital childbearing, high rates of divorce, and all the rest, that a judge could say, oh, that male-female part doesn't matter either. So here, I like to cite Pope Benedict. Benedict was a world-class theologian, very intellectual guy, and yet he's famous for saying it's not the arguments of the theologians and the philosophers that win converts, it's the lives of the saints. That it's the beauty of holiness that converts people. And so I think here on the marriage issue, that needs to be the lesson we take away, that unless we're using our freedom to live in the truth, what good is our freedom in the first place? And so the challenge for us is, what can we do within our churches, within our schools, within our ministries, our charities, within every walk of life in which you exercise leadership and stewardship to strengthen the family, to build a strong culture of marriage in which you encourage teenagers to start preparing now to be good husbands and wives, where you help newlyweds to be good mothers and fathers, in which you give the type of marriage preparation and marriage counseling where people can work out their differences and reconcile and stay together for the sake of that family and for any children that are involved. If we have holy, happy families, that's going to be our best defense in the public square. And I say that as someone who's written 2 books about marriage. Right? I mean, it's not that the intellectual work doesn't matter. It's that the intellectual work is ultimately at the service of the lived reality. It's not the arguments that we want to win. It's the lives that we want transformed, the lives that we want to flourish. So with that, I'm going to stop, look at my watch quickly. I think we have like 10, 15 minutes for questions. So I'm happy to hear what you're interested in, and then if I can provide answers, I will do my best to do so. So the floor is open. Yep, right here in the front.
Yes, we hear the argument about discriminating against gays and lesbians. How dare you, black churches, be bigots when you have been discriminated against over there from a historic perspective? I'd like to hear your...
Yeah, great question. So, I get this question a lot when I speak on college campuses. They say, well, wait, aren't you just like the racists who were against interracial marriage if you're against same-sex marriage? And I imagine it's much more offensive to you to hear that charge if you're someone who actually suffered through the Jim Crow South and segregation and racism. Because the reality here is that it's much easier today to be gay or lesbian than it is to be African American, especially than it was in the Deep South 50 years ago. And so to kind of hijack the legacy of the civil rights movement, I have found is rather offensive to people who lived through the civil rights movement. But it's not just the historical point, it's also a conceptual point. From the very first page of the book of Genesis to the very last page of the book of Revelation, marriage is talked about using spousal imagery of male and female, but never in terms of black and white.
That's right.
Laws that banned interracial marriage weren't based on the theology or the philosophy of marriage. They were based on white supremacy. If you read the scriptures, if you read all of the great theologians, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, they never talk about marriage in terms of skin color or in terms of race. They always talk about marriage in terms of sexual complementarity. It's the two halves of humanity, male and female, that are united in marriage. So to say that viewing marriage as a male-female relationship is the functional equivalent of racism is not only insulting, it also just gets the theology, the biblical revelation, the philosophy, and the history wrong. So it's insulting both on kind of like a personal level, but also on an intellectual level, because it's such a bad argument. Marriage laws need to be colorblind because race has no bearing on what marriage is. A man and a woman can unite in marriage regardless of their race. They can become one flesh. So think of the language that the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Genesis, use. A man and a woman become one flesh. A man and a woman can do that regardless of their racial heritage, their ethnic identity, their skin color. Children need a mom and a dad regardless of their racial heritage. And so to suggest that a child's right to a mom and a dad is the equivalent of racism just strikes me as an intellectually bankrupt argument. And to say that what gays and lesbians face in America today is similar to what African Americans in the 60s faced in the Jim Crow South just also strikes me as a historical non-starter. So I mean, if that's helpful, if other questions on that theme, we could talk more about it, or we can go to a different topic, whatever. It looks like you want to get in, so yeah.
Something that you said, that especially given the fact that we have pastors and bishops and leaders here, you made the statement that the issue isn't so much an argument that's won as much as a life that's changed.
Yep.
Seems that what you're suggesting is that the implication of that for those of us who are gathered here isn't just simply what happens in Washington, but what happens in our respective churches.
Oh, yeah.
In our community.
Oh, yes.
And that is just as important as what's going on in Washington. Brethren, we need to hear that.
Yes.
We need to hear that.
That's exactly right. It needs to be a both and. You know, too often you hear people saying it's either this or it's that. It's both. You have to care about what's going on in Washington, D.C. You have to care about what's going on in your state house. You have to care about what's going on at City Hall. And you need to care about what's going on in your church. Your local church, your church organization, if you belong to a larger denomination, you need to care. All of these things matter. And so good stewardship is going to say wherever you exercise leadership, and whether it's as a political figure, a pastoral figure, a church governance, if you're a bishop, a pastor, you need to make sure that all of those communities are solid on this issue. Because the law matters, the culture matters, preaching matters, pastoral care matters. It all makes a difference. Yes?
Can you go back to both of these questions are awesome. And you're, man, wow.
Thank you.
All around here, I'm around knowing that I am. Going back home and saying, boy, you got a dumb pastor.
He cleared his schedule to be with y'all. He cleared his schedule, came from Australia, wherever he was.
I don't know if it's clear the discriminatory issue for me.
Okay.
You were very astute in how you addressed it, but how did you eliminate the discriminatory?
Sure. I mean, so think about it this way. Discrimination takes place all the time. And the question is it justified or unjustified discrimination? So consider the I Have a Dream speech. Martin Luther King Jr. says that his dream is that his children will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So there is discrimination, right? There's a judgment taking place, and it's the judgment based on action, not skin color. And he says the problem with racism, and this is something that Aristotle and Kant argued as well, is that morality and virtue and vice, nobility and ignobility, it's all about how we act. And your race says nothing about your character. If I tell you so-and-so is white, so-and-so is black, I've told you nothing about the content of their character. But it's reasonable, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with the Bible's judgment about the nature of marriage. Right? It's a union of a man and a woman. It's reasonable to make a judgment about behavior. Right? If you make the judgment that non-marital sexual behavior is wrong, you can agree or disagree. It's at least the type of judgment that is legitimate for these sorts of debates. Right? So you don't have to agree with the baker, the florist, and the photographer who says, well, I don't accept same-sex marriage, to say that that's at least a plausible judgment that she's making. Whereas making any judgment on the basis of race, knowing someone's racial heritage, their ethnic background, their skin color, doesn't reveal a thing about their character. Yeah?
And I join everyone else. We're just being blessed to hear you. I preach often, and I think you've helped me today. I've said many times from the pulpit that discrimination is not a dirty word, that we discriminate every day. We choose one gas station over another, one bank opposed to another. But when it's racial discrimination, that's wrong. But to discriminate based on behavior and deviant behavior at that, that's biblical.
Yeah. I mean, so think about it this way. We discriminate all the time. Right? So it used to be said that people have a discriminating palate if they could judge good food from bad food, fine wine. I don't have a discriminating palate. Right? I just eat cheap stuff. But people who do have a discriminate can tell fine wine from cheap wine. It's all the same to me. But when you're deciding, what sort of suit do I want to buy, right? I want to have good fashion. You discriminate between the ugly and the beautiful. Here the question is justified versus unjustified. And racial discrimination is unjustified discrimination because race isn't the basis of good or bad, right or wrong, beautiful or ugly, right? That's the whole point that MLK is getting at when he says the content of the character, not the color of the skin. But it's totally appropriate for the church to be judging actions. The Bible is full of judgments about action. And I don't think you want to cede your ability to say sin is sin, right is right, wrong is wrong. Because it seems to me that that's the prophetic task of the church. Yeah?
It's interesting what you're saying because it helps us not only in the issue of marriage, but even in the issue of abortion, in that children are being discriminated against because they're not considered to be valuable to the mother who chooses to abort. And it's unjustified. On top of that, the fact that people want to force us to embrace their values, they will not accept our values. And that's the conflict is, you want me to accept you, but you don't want to accept me. It's a double standard. Now, for us as pastors, our call is to, first of all, be the husband of one wife, to model marriage in a beautiful way for our congregation, to do everything we can in our congregation to help people stay married. And then you talked about the fact that we deny children the right for a mom and a dad. It's in the abstinence education world, we call that advantage discrimination. Statistics show that marriage is beneficial for people from a health perspective, from a psychological. So when we deny people the opportunity to experience that in a healthy way, we are discriminating against the advantage that they could have as a result. And so to make a child grow up in a family with two moms and be denied the opportunity to have a dad, and the single parent issue doesn't make that invalid. Does that make sense? Because people try to
we want to respond to both of those.
Right. People say, well, a lot of people raised without a dad, they grow up fine.
And I think Obama is the exception that proves the rule, because he did turn out fine, regardless of your politics. You can say that he's leading a fulfilling life, even if you disagree with his politics. He had a grandfather involved, but yet even he speaks out about the importance of fathers because he knows firsthand that his life was more challenging. Today, the new poverty numbers were released by the Census Bureau. The best anti-poverty program known to mankind is a married mother and father. It's not a government, food stamp program. It's not an after-school basketball program. It's having that mom and dad commit to each other and commit to the child. And so if you believe in social justice, like I do, if you care about the poor, if you care about social mobility, if you care about inequality, the inequality that matters most is familial inequality. Those children who are given the great blessing of having their married mom and dad raise them, and those children who aren't. And I think the other thing that you mentioned that I think is really a keen observation is that wanted and unwanted is not a legitimate basis for discriminating against unborn children. Right? If human dignity is intrinsic because we're all made in the image and likeness of God, then whether you're wanted or unwanted, whether you're useful or not useful, whether you're highly skilled or poorly skilled, we're all equal in dignity. And therefore, it's an unjustified form of discrimination to say, well, the wanted child or the useful child should get special protections and not the disabled or, yeah.
And I'm working in a city now where they're working to build a $10 million animal shelter because they don't want to eliminate any pets. $10 million.
And right next door will be a Planned Parenthood. And they don't see the inconsistency. And that's why the prophetic voice of the church is to point out these inconsistencies. Yes?
There's been a 4-point prescription that Starr talks about, Rick Santorum talks about.
The success sequence.
If you do these things in this order, there's an 80% chance you will not live in poverty. Get your education, get a job, get married, then have children.
In that order.
In that order. Starr talks about it. I know Bill Carson, when we met him a couple years ago, talks about it. How come that gets such a vile reaction from the liberals? Because it's so common sense. But when you share that and you hear people like Rick Santorum that said when he was running for president, it was like he was bringing the devil out of him. How did he respond? Because it's so common sense. And it is the prescription for a wonderful, happy, peaceful life. If you do those things,
Yep.
80% or maybe it's more, maybe more than 80% that you won't live in poverty.
Oh, it's more than 80%.
Yeah, I think it's something that you have a 4% chance of experiencing poverty if you do those. So that would be 96. But what's interesting? That 4-step plan, which they call the success sequence, comes out of the Brookings Institution, which is one of the liberal think tanks here in D.C. Stewart's now there, yeah. Stewart's now, and it was Ron Haskins and Elizabeth Sawhill who first came up with that. Elizabeth Sawhill is a liberal Democrat, but she knows empirically that if you do those 4 things, your life will be much better than if you don't. And so what we now see, though, is a distinction between kind of the reasonable liberals and the ideological liberals. And what we have to do is we need to persuade the reasonable liberals. I don't think you can persuade the ideologues, right? The extremists, the activists, you can't persuade them. But the reasonable ones, you can say, if you really care about the poor, here's something we can do together. Encourage people to graduate from high school, get a job, and get married, and then have kids. If you do those things, your life will go that much better. And I also think the same thing will be true in religious liberty. The activists and the ideologues want to see that 70-year-old grandmother go to jail for not baking a gay wedding cake or pay $1,000 fine. I think the reasonable liberals say, live and let live. If you're in favor of gay marriage, bake a gay wedding cake. If you're not in favor of it, don't bake the gay wedding cake. And one other idea that popped into my head that goes to your question is that the 70-year-old grandmother, she's an evangelical, she's actually the florist, not the baker. She's had gay employees, and she was selling flowers to this particular gay couple for a decade. It was only when they asked about a same-sex wedding that she said, I had to say no. So she wasn't discriminating against people because they're gay or lesbian. She's employed gay people. She's sold flowers. It was only the wedding because of her belief about what marriage is.
And then they sold her out.
Well, it's unclear. They didn't sue her directly. The Attorney General did, and we don't know how the Attorney General found out. Somehow word got around. You've been wanting to ask the question. This will probably be the last one. I'm just looking at the clock. So, yeah.
I was going to make sure I heard you right. So I want to have you respond to this, which I agree with. You said it's harder to be African American than it is to be gay and lesbian.
Yeah, I mean, so if you think about discrimination, look at the Fortune 500 companies. The day that the Supreme Court redefined marriage, they were all flying a rainbow flag. The White House was illuminated in rainbow colors. They all have special programs already voluntarily enacted. Compare that to when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted and the situation, and it's, I mean, it really is, I mean, it makes people, because it's such an absurd comparison. And put it this way, if you are a Bible-believing conservative in corporate America, or if you're gay or lesbian in corporate America, who has a safer managerial, if you're reporting to the CEO and the board of trustees, who's more likely to share your worldview? And I don't think it's the conservative evangelicals and Catholics that have. I mean, I was at an Ivy League school as an undergraduate. It was much harder being a conservative there than to say I'm in favor. Had I said I'm in favor of gay marriage, it wouldn't have raised an eyebrow. If I say I'm in favor of traditional marriage, that raises eyebrows.